I'm Nana van Tilburg for Biznews. Well, many books have been written about Asia's economic success stories, and the question invariably follows, what can Africa learn from them, and what can we emulate in South Africa? Well, I've got Moeletsi Mbeki, the political analyst, today to discuss if there are examples of the Eastern countries that we should follow, and whether that's the right example we've been looking for. I'm Moeletsi. Welcome to Biznews.
Hello. Hi, Linda. It's good to be on your show.
So, if you look at GDP growth of a country like South Korea and you compare it to South Africa, in the 60s it was almost similar, and then it diverged, and South Korea grew and South Africa didn't. So, what can we learn from that?
Well, the Asian countries have a very different history, modern history, let me say, from that of South Africa. So it's not very helpful to look at what's going on in East Asia and then say South Africa should do the same thing, because our circumstances are very different. And by modern history, I'm talking about the last 500 years since Columbus's journeys to the Americas, because that's when the modern world starts. It is with Columbus's journey to the Americas, and South Africa. What Columbus discovered, what was called the New World. These were the countries in the Americas and in the Caribbean that got conquered by the Europeans, people like Cortez and so on. They became the colonies of the European powers of the time, which were Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, of course, Britain more than anyone else. So South Africa belongs to that group of countries. What distinguishes East Asia from those groups of countries is that East Asia was never conquered in that sense during that period. There were a few countries in East Asia where, for example, the European powers had certain privileges, like in China and so on. But the characteristic of the New World countries was the transfer of population from Europe to the New World, or of free population from Europe to the New World, and the transfer of enslaved population from Africa to the New World. That's what distinguishes the New World from the rest of the world. So when you are looking at comparisons between different parts of the world, you have to compare like with like. East Asia, there was no setup or transfer of population from Europe to Asia, to East Asia. There was no transfer of African slaves to East Asia. So that has a huge impact on the development of these countries over the last 500 years. The most prominent member of the New World is, of course, the United States, which was a British colony, where people were transferred from Britain to set up colonies in what is today the United States, and they were controlled by the King of England, and their economy was designed from England, and they sent white people to the Americas, and they got slaves from Africa to provide the labor. So that distinguishes the New World from from the old world, if you wish, which was Europe and Asia, that we could call the first world or the old world.
So do you think that the new world or the United States is the example that South Africa should follow in its development? Isn't it totally different?
No, actually, the irony about the United States and South Africa is that they're very similar. We had slaves transferred from Africa. In fact, the first group of slaves that Van Riebeeck, the Dutch founder of South Africa, if you wish, were children which he captured from a Portuguese ship going to Brazil, and they were amongst the first slaves. And then there were slaves brought in from Java and from Bengal and then from Madagascar, from Mozambique. That was the slave, and that's how South Africa was established. And there were new crops which were brought into South Africa from Holland, like grapes, for example, apples, wheat. These were crops that were not there in South Africa before. The United States had the same thing. They had slaves transferred from Africa to the United States. And they grew tobacco, and they grew cotton, and all sorts of crops that were required by England. So they were made to grow those crops and to supply those crops. And those crops, especially cotton, became the foundation of the Industrial Revolution in England, which then became the Industrial Revolution. It spread to the rest of Europe. But the cotton was grown by African slaves who were driven by white slave owners, who were the British people who were sent to colonize the Americas. In the same way that first the Dutch drove the slaves in South Africa, and then the British took over in 1795 and took over South Africa. So both the United States and South Africa were British colonies, and their economies were established to meet British demands and to satisfy the economies of Britain, not to satisfy the economies of those countries.
So where did the success story diverge between South Africa and the USA?
You see, what happened with the United was that the colonies started to rebel against their home government, if you wish, in the New World. And the United States led that rebellion of the colonies against the colonial power. So they fought a war against British government and British control of the United States. They fought a long war between 1776 and 1783. And that's how they got their independence. However, the colonial economic system remained in place even after the political independence. It was only nearly 90 years later that the Americans fought another war to dismantle the colonial economic system. This war is known as the American Civil War, which was fought amongst the Americans with the pro-British slave owners who were exporting cotton to Britain against the rest of the population who felt they needed to industrialize the country. So and luckily for the Americans, the Civil War now, the European powers, Britain in particular, was very, very tempted to intervene in support of slavery and the slave owners. but there could have been an intervention by France in support of the non-slave owners. So in the end, they decided not to intervene. So the Civil War lasted from 1861 up to 1865. But what was so important about the Civil War was that first it freed the slaves, and it did not compensate the slave owners. It just destroyed their capital, because the slaves were capital of the slave owners. So Lincoln freed the slaves, and then they were defeated. So then the United States stopped being a colonial economy that exports raw material to the colonial. That's where the role model comes in. South Africa, we have our independence, although we lost all the wars against Britain. But anyway, we have our independence of sorts. But the colonial economy that the British put in place is still in place, which was the economy to exploit the mineral resources and sell the raw materials to Britain in the first instance, and then, of course, to the rest of the world. So the role model for South Africa, why the United States is a role model, is that it dismantled the colonial economy that that the British had set up in America, which was exporting raw material on slave labor or cheap labor. We still have a raw material-based economy exporting minerals based on cheap labor. Okay, they are not slaves, but they are called migrant workers in the case of South Africa. So that is where we still have to go. We still have to overcome the colonial economic system that we inherited. It's a very tough call. As you know, in the Civil War in the United States, more than 600,000 people were killed in order to dismantle the colonial economy, in that war to dismantle the colonial economy. And Abraham Lincoln himself eventually got assassinated. So we in South Africa have not even begun to dismantle the colonial economy that Britain set up in South Africa. That's where the United States is a role model for us. Until we do that, we will continue with the levels of poverty that we have, the levels of unemployment at 40% that we are sitting with. Because raw material export economy benefits the colonial importer, it does not benefit the exporter. Because the importer is the one who adds value to the raw material and then creates, as in the case of Britain, the textile industry, and in the case of South Africa, the engineering industries that we are developed in the rest of the world on the back of South African minerals.
But we've been talking about beneficiation. I mean, for years, from the apartheid years, we said we should beneficiate our own minerals. I mean, what concrete steps could be made to break what you call this colonial hold on our economy?
Well, the people who own the minerals of South Africa, at the end of the day, a big part of them are the foreign investors. And a big part of them come through the London Stock Exchange. So they are not interested in the beneficiation of these minerals. They want to export raw diamonds, they want to export raw chrome, they want to export raw iron ore. They are exporting iron ore. I mean, we have, for example, Anglo-American Corporation, which was set up by Ernest Oppenheimer. It started off, ironically, in South Africa, but today it is a British company. And they are exporting iron ore instead of beneficiating. If I can give you an example of Sweden. Sweden has very rich iron ore deposits, but Sweden does not export iron ore. It exports what are called iron pellets, which are beneficiated iron ore with a very high iron content. South Africa exports raw iron ore. You just dig up the soil. You can see it is red earth, it's red stones. Put them on a train and then put them on a ship and export them. Sweden doesn't do that. Sweden has exports iron pellets. Interestingly, South Africa used to import iron pellets from Australia for a steel industry that we had in Saldanha. So in Saldanha, you would get iron ore being exported to the rest of the world, and then we import beneficiated iron pellets from Australia for our own steel mills. So that's what we have in South Africa is actually what I would call a neo-colonial economy, which depends on the export of raw materials.
So how do we break that hold of what you call the neo-colonial economy on South Africa?
Well, if I had an answer, Linda, I would definitely be a billionaire. I'll be richer than the BEE billionaires. The reality is that it's a political issue. It's very clear, in the last 100 years, 120 years, South Africa has had the politics of nationalism. The nationalism of the Afrikaners, and then the nationalism of the Africans. The nationalism of the Afrikaners were around where their party was the National Party, which ruled South Africa more or less continuously from 1924 till 1994. Now we have the nationalism of the Africans, which rules South Africa from 1994 to the present. But the nationalists actually form an alliance with the colonial power, with the ex-colonial power. And that is what has been going on. The Afrikaner nationalists of the National Party continued the colonial economy. They creamed off from the top, which the British didn't mind them doing so, but the economy remained a colonial economy. The ANC is doing the same thing. The economy remains a raw material exporting semi-colonial economy, but they are creaming off for the top, for the small privileged elite of the African middle class, in the same way that you have a small privileged group of the Afrikaner elite during the rule of the National Party. So what you're faced with in South Africa is a political. It's not an economic challenge. You are faced with a political challenge, a political challenge to the nationalists. That is who are in alliance with the exporters of raw material. For example, a couple of years ago, China bought our largest chrome mining company. So China is in on this act of exporting raw materials from South Africa. It's no longer just the Europeans or the British. They are also in on this, but the ANC allows this to happen. And secondly, we've just had a railway line completed to export raw manganese. Now, chrome is a key ingredient in the manufacture of stainless steel, and so is manganese in the strengthening of steel. So what we need in South Africa, interestingly, there was the famous Chinese prime minister. He toured Africa in 1964, I think. He visited the independent African countries. His name was Zhou Enlai. He was one of China's revolutionaries, communist revolutionaries, and one of and he became prime minister under Mao Zedong. And after his tour of Africa, Zhou Enlai made the observation that Africa needs a revolution. And he didn't say what kind of revolution. He just said Africa needs a revolution. And when you look at South Africa, you can see South Africa needs a political revolution to overcome the export of raw materials. Obviously, there are those who benefit from the export of those raw materials who will resist the beneficiation of raw materials in South Africa in the same way that the slave owners in the United States resisted the beneficiation of cotton in the United States, which was the setting up of a textile industry in the United States. They resisted that, and that ended up in a civil war. Hopefully in South Africa, we hope that we don't end up in a civil war, but we certainly have. South Africa has to change. The economic system has to change if we are to industrialize the country properly and absorb all the into the labor market all the people, the economically active people in South Africa. That, at the end of the day, is the objective, that everyone who wants work should work. Our economy at the moment as a raw materials exporter, 40% of our population who want to work can't work because the value add to our minerals is happening outside our country.
So do we have the capability to establish proper industrialization or a beneficiation?
Well, at the heart of beneficiation are two things: the political change and the political will, which we don't have at the moment, as I pointed out. The second part is, of course, the human capital. You have to have the people with the skills to be able to beneficiate, because you need higher and higher technology as you beneficiate your raw material. You need more and more skilled people. We don't have that at the moment. So the political change will also have to redesign our education system. Our education system today in South Africa is very focused on high-end academic professionals. But to industrialize an economy, you need a whole spectrum of skills, not just the top end of PhDs. You need a whole lot of other people who should be skilled on the assembly lines, on the manufacturing of components, etc., etc. So that is what the other thing that has to change in South Africa. So you can see when I say South Africa needs a revolution, there are so many entrenched players in our society who benefit from the status quo. For example, if you look at our largest teachers' union, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, they control practically the school's education system to the benefit of the teachers, not of the children, let alone of the country. Now, those people are going to fight against the change. And they have allies. The ANC is one of their biggest allies. So they will fight against the change. So you can see why, to be able to industrialize a country like South Africa, you have to go. That's why the United States is a role model for us, is because they had to fight those forces in their country who were against the industrialization of the country.
Moeletsi Mbeki, thank you so much. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.